educate people on what was in the settlement agreement, what the investigation consists of. Over 500 people showed up on February 18th to speak in front of Judge Michael Simon, who is where the case now lays. And so Judge Simon, sometime after March 25th, which is our next court date, will decide whether or not to accept the settlement agreement or not accept it. It is our hope that he doesn't accept it. And the reason is because the Department of Justice didn't ask the community that had been most impacted by police violence, what did we think should be in the settlement agreement? What did we think would be fair? In fact, the agreement was negotiated behind closed doors with our former mayor, Sam Adams, and the Department of Justice. And so the public only saw it when it came to the city council for the city council to vote on it. And so right now, we're in the sweet spot because when 500 community members show up at a federal courthouse, the federal judge pays attention. And so the judge sent to the city of Portland, to the Portland Police Association, and to the Department of Justice, 13 questions that came up based on the testimony he heard at the fairness hearing. And the questions were around, do you think the independent police review process is adequate to review police complaints? Now, for us, that was an easy question. But what I loved about the judge's questions is it was clear he'd listened to the public. And after 18 hours of testimony, he had heard over and over and over again that we don't have any accountability built into our system, that we do not trust the police to police themselves, and therefore what we truly need is a truly independent police review process. And we developed one and gave it to the Department of Justice when they did their original investigation. As part of my firm, we developed what we call a truly independent police review process. And we gave it to the Department of Justice, and we thought, oh great, they're going to just slide that into the settlement agreement. They didn't. They took a sentence out of a 10-page document and added it to the settlement agreement, and then said to me, we heard you. We incorporated your recommendations into the settlement agreement. They did. And so, it is my belief that the people of Portland will be better off if Judge Simon rejects the settlement agreement, because what happens when he rejects it is then we get to go to trial. So the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division will have to take the city of Portland to trial and prove that Portland police officers are using excessive force against people in our community. For the community, that would be a win, because what we have now with the settlement agreement, if it goes as the Department of Justice and the city and the PPA, the Portland Police Union would like it to go, the status quo will continue. The only reason we as a community are hopeful now is because of the organizing we did to get people to show up at the fairness hearing. Without that organizing, the Department of Justice didn't do any organizing. In fact, they were a little miffed with us when they found out we were actually talking to the public about this settlement agreement, because I believe in most parts of the country, it's a pro forma, right? Nobody shows up, maybe 10 people show up, and it's just a performer, right? Whatever they've negotiated, the judge just accepts and it's done. But we surprised the DOJ a little bit. We certainly surprised the city of Portland. And so what we're hopeful is that the judge says, no, this agreement is not fair, it's not adequate, and it's not reasonable, and therefore we're going to set a trial date. I believe setting a trial date then allows, that forces, not allows, forces the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, the city of Portland, and the police union back to the table. Let me give an example about why it is so frustrating and why we ended up going to the federal government. Here's a great rule. It's not a great rule, but this is a rule that's been in the Portland police contract for a while. So if you're a police officer and you shoot someone, you have 48 hours before you have to give a statement. And you may think, well, why? And the why, the reason that police give is that they're traumatized after they have shot someone, and they need that time to get their thoughts together. Now, if I shoot you, I'm not going to get 48 hours to get my thoughts together and to get over being traumatized by the fact that I shot you. But if I am a trained professional, I need 48 hours before I can tell you what happened 48 hours ago. Now, our city council had a chance to change this year because the contract was up. They could have changed it. But unfortunately, we lacked one thing: political will. We lacked the political will to just draw a line in the sand and say, sorry, that rule's gone. And so it's in the new contract. So now, as a member of the public, we've got to wait till 2017. And I've been working on this one for 10 years. So we got to wait till 2017 now in order to have a chance of taking that out of the police contract. And so, I don't think that police are just genetically racist, but I think that we have created a police force that works primarily for the business interests and not for the individuals that live in our communities. And I'll give you two great examples. As Portland Police, we're under investigation with the Department of Justice. So this is with the federal government looking you in your eyeballs. They roll out two new programs. The first one is called Stop and Pat. You heard of Stop and Frisk, right? That's New York's lingo, right? And Oregon, Portland, we've got a more user-friendly one called Stop and Pat. Now, this is how this works. Portland police officers are now required to spend 15 minutes of every hour talking to community members engaged in what used to be called community policing, right? However, Portland police officers are a fearful bunch, and in some neighborhoods, they can't actually have dialogue until they are sure that the people they are talking to don't have weapons on them. And so, I thought, that must mean that they're downtown, patting down business owners, because downtown Portland has the highest rate of concealed weapons permits. That must be what they're doing, right? Wrong. They're over in low-income neighborhoods. They're patting down African American and Latino youth. And this is part of their community policing strategy. But I don't want you to think it's just race. There's another new program that they've started. It's called Prosper Portland. Now, Prosper Portland is about making houseless individuals downtown invisible. And this is how it works. So if I'm in a doorway of an abandoned building, a police officer walks up and gives me a ticket for loitering. Now, the ticket for loitering is kind of like a traffic ticket, like not that big a deal. However, if I don't show up for my court date, well, look, let's wait before that. So I got my ticket for loitering. I got my first ticket, it's for loitering. Well, a week later, that same police officer sees me in the same location. So now, I get a ticket for interfering with a peace officer. So now I got two tickets. Well, the police officer one is a misdemeanor. So again, first I got the citation, which is kind of like a traffic ticket. Then I'm facing a misdemeanor as I have an interfering with a peace officer. But I'm houseless, so I don't get the notice when I'm supposed to show up in court as the nice friendly reminder that they send. And so because I don't get the notice, now there's a warrant out for my arrest. Oh my. Now there's a bench warrant, so guess what? Now I'm facing a felony charge. And what was my original crime? Being houseless. Both of those projects, both of those programs were created while the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division was watching and paying attention. And guess what? They didn't say a word. Guess what? The city of Portland, they didn't say a word. The police chief, he goes on TV and radio, and he's just, oh, these are so wonderful community policing programs. You would be so thrilled with these. These are great. But nobody else seems to think that there's a problem when you're targeting segments of the community for policing. So, what's next? Next is March 25th, we go back in front of the federal judge, all the parties in the case. What I didn't tell you was that the AMA Coalition for Justice and Police Reform is in a unique position, and no one else in the country had the opportunity to have friend of the court status when the Department of Justice came to town. And it's interesting, we ended up with friends of the court status because we were so appalled at what the settlement agreement was. We made the argument that the Department of Justice did not represent us. We, as a coalition, we did not believe the Department of Justice represented us. And the judge agreed. The judge said, okay. And so that gives us a unique status of being able to talk directly to the federal judge. In most communities where these settlement agreements are filed, it's just the DOJ, the city, and the police department that's involved. And so it is our hope on the 25th, the parties will go back in, they'll answer the judge's 13 questions. They've already done that in writing, but the judge will now take all arguments from the attorneys. And then a short time after that, the judge will make a decision. And so if the judge accepts the agreement, then we as the community believe that we're going to be like stuck until 2017. Because what we believe is that the political structure will say, we fixed the police. We spent $26 million. They're fixed. They're done. We don't have to make any more changes. And so we're hoping that the judge rejects it and prepares them for trial. I don't believe that all the police that work for the city of Portland fit this criteria. But what I know to be true is that they protect each other. So even if they are not themselves involved in this kind of behavior, the fact that they will protect people who do this means that they really should not be Portland police officers. Fresh Hour, I told you about the sharpshooter that was on the roof. We are all paying him to sit home now, join a full salary, because he was fired. And that's what happens when we fire Portland police. They go through an arbitration process, and the arbitrator, 99.99999% of the time, gives them their job back. And that's what happened with Fresh Hour. But luckily, the last mayor drew a line in the sand and said, we don't want him back on the force. So he appealed that ruling. Now that's good in some ways for the community because he's not in uniform and not working on our street. But in many ways it's bad for the community because we're paying him full salary indefinitely while we wait for the court case to be solved. And so, it is my hope that by the time you guys are out of college, that you will take over these systems that we have, because it is the systems that are broken, right? And we keep trying to repair broken systems, when in fact what should happen is the systems need to be dismantled and rebuilt, because they weren't built for a multicultural, multiracial, multi-inclusive community. They were really built to serve one population. And anybody else who could get it, cool. But that's what the systems were built for. And when you look at our criminal justice system, one of the things Michelle Alexander says so well is that you can look over any system. I can take education, for example. And I can tell you that in Portland Public Schools, if you're an African-American male, you're 4 times more likely to be suspended than if you're a white student in Portland Public Schools. And that's now. That's today. That's not back in the Jim Crow days. That's today. I can tell you that if you're African-American, if I go in to see a doctor, and with the same symptoms as a white woman, today, if I went her and I went to the exact same doctor with the exact same symptoms, today she would get more tests, more medication, more options than I would get. Is it because the medical profession is racist? No. It's because the system that has been set up to provide health care makes assumptions about people based on race, based on social economic status, based on gender. And what they would tell you is that the data shows that African American women don't pay attention and won't follow instructions that the doctor gives them. So the doctor gives them very little instructions or very few choices. That's what they will tell you the data shows, right? So it's not a conscious thing. It is an unconscious thing that has significant repercussions for all of us. So I can tell you about healthcare, I can tell you about police, I can tell you about the education. And so across these systems, we have disparities. And we have the disparities are so significant. What's amazing is that people aren't more outraged about how these disparities persist over the years. So I had to pick one area, and so that's why I work on police accountability. Because I figured I would go crazy if I tried to go from this one to that one. I spent about a decade working on health disparities. And it was consistent across the board. I don't know if you've heard, but there's a report that was created by the Coalition of Communities of Color. And a couple of years ago, they partnered with Portland State University. And this is available online. If you went to coalitionofcommunitiesofcolor.org, you can get this report and 8 individual reports. What this report tells you is that the closer people of color get to Multnomah County, the sicker they get. In fact, they use the term that Multnomah County is toxic to people of color. And if you look at the data, and what they did, so this was a report on all communities of color combined. And then they did individual reports. They did a report on immigrants, on African immigrants. They did one on Latino population, African American population. And so the books all have very specific information about across the board, whether you're talking education, income level, whether you're talking incarceration rates. They did the data, because what I know in all my years working here is most of the time when people of color say, these disparities are they're just crazy, right? What we hear is, well, I'm sorry, the numbers aren't statistically significant, and so we can't track the numbers. And so because communities got tired of hearing that, they went to Portland State University and paid a certified smart person to develop the data so they can now take it to policymakers and say, okay, now what you got? And if I was at Multnomah County when they got this first report, and it's really ironic when you listen to elected leaders say things like, well, I had no idea. Well, wait a minute, you're a county commissioner, this is your district, you're making decisions every single day that impact these numbers, and you had no idea? How'd you get your job? And so, these reports are available online. I would really encourage you to get those reports. And before I end and open it up for questions, because I want to hear what you want to ask me, I want to tell you about a resource that you can get online. Because as I talk about the new Jim Crow, what I find is that it is hard sometimes for people to even open conversations about race, right? It's like people don't even know where to start having that conversation. How do you open it up? And I think Trayvon Martin's, what happened to him was a jumping off point for an opportunity for white people to have conversations with white people about race. And I have a tool, but I'm going to give you the website number, that actually you can download online, and whether you want to spend a minute, 20 minutes, an hour, or more time actually figuring out how to engage people in conversations around race, I have found this tool really helpful, right? Because we're never going to move to this colorblind society until we as a community are comfortable talking about race. I mean, why is that conversation so uncomfortable? I remember when I was growing up, we used to talk about America as a melting pot, right? As if people moved here and we all kind of melted into like one flavor or something, right? Then they talked about us as a tossed salad, as if, you know, we just all kind of intermingled and we would all just have parts of each other on us. But to be real, we've never, as a country, ever had an open conversation about race. You may remember Obama tried it in his first term, right, around the what was that? Never mind. I'll move on. Obama tried it actually because, the professor, right? The professor that was locked up by the cops at his own house, right? Because it was late at night and he couldn't find his key and his neighbors called the cops on him. Can't remember his name. Thank you. Gates. Obama tried to have a conversation about race with beer, sitting around the table, and he got slammed. He got slammed in the press, right? What is he trying to do? Why is he having that conversation? He shouldn't be doing that. And we can't have any fear that he's somehow only the president of black people, right? Because he hasn't done much for black people since he's been in office, so we can't say he's only working for black people. We don't talk about race because we've never been really open about race, right? I mean, we don't feel comfortable walking up to people that we don't know, that's from a different culture, and just saying, tell me something about you, right? I'd like to learn more about you. Where are you from? Oh, what was it like growing up there? I mean, why is that so hard as a culture for us to do? I think it is so hard because we just want to pretend that everything is fine, right? Because if you open up the conversation, then you have to get deeper, and you have to actually open yourself up for that conversation. You have to actually be willing to embarrass yourself, right? And I think that's it sometimes too. People are like, wow, I'll say the wrong thing. But saying nothing is worse, especially if you aren't taking the opportunity to get to know and learn people that are different than you. And so, what's on your mind? I'm going to open it up. Who's got a question? You? I'll come to you later, baby. It's not fair. You're my husband.
What is anything that you can do to push back on gangs?
I will hold that question for just a moment, my love, and I will get back to it. Any other questions? Are you going to make me go and answer my husband's question? I'll get to that one. The report, the Coalition of Communities of Color, it is called Communities of Color, Multnomah County, an Unsettling Profile. Okay, so, yes ma'am.
Regarding the last topic that you just were discussing, how would you recommend the tool for going about discussing and further educating ourselves if there's issues with microaggressions going on?
Say a little bit about microaggression. I'm starting to hear that term more. What does that mean?
Well, I went to the event last night and learned all about it, but it has to do with, just because it was brought up, I was just like, oh, this is a different point of view. Microaggressions have to do with like subtle comments that we make towards specific race, gender, anything. It happens day to day. It's sort of subtle. It could come off as a compliment, but it's more subtle. So if I said a woman brought up when people ask about the accent, where it's from, that can sometimes be too personal for some people to answer. And so being interested in the topic, how would individuals make themselves not come off as microaggressive?
Well, I think it's one-on-one, right? I mean, it is the one-on-one, eyeball-to-eyeball conversation, right? And you can say, you know, I'm not good at this, right? But I'm really trying to educate myself about different cultures, and so I just want to have a cup of coffee. Can we just have a cup of coffee together, right? It doesn't have to be anything major, right? But it's important to actually just to make yourself a little vulnerable to that conversation. Because what you want the person to know is, I genuinely have an interest in you. This is not like a science project. I'm not inspecting people from different cultures in that manner, right? But I want to get to know you and something about what makes you tick. I think that helps a lot. Yes, sir.
Given the ownership of our largest newspapers, the makeup of their editorial boards, and the dearth of representation of minority communities in the staff, even at a staff level, what tactics or strategies do you feel are being used or you recommend that can bring this to people's attention better? Because there's a giant filter in this community when it comes to newspaper and news, and a lot of this is simply just filtered out by the editorial board very subtly. And the greater community, it's one of those you don't know what you don't know, and they seem to make sure that people are not knowing these things.
Well, you know, it's even worse than that. In fact, I train people to look at the news and read the newspaper in a critical fashion, because it's so bad with the major media nowadays. Let me give you an example. I know that Portland Police Bureau have full-time public information officers that spend all day sending press releases out to the press. And guess what? It's all about crime. It's all about somebody got robbed here, somebody got attacked over here. And so the goal is to keep us in a state of fear, right? But when you're watching the newscast, if you hear the newscaster say, and Portland Police says, so-and-so robbed 7-Eleven today, news at 11. What you didn't hear was a quote from the clerk at the 7-Eleven store. What you didn't hear was a quote from witnesses. And so for me, I asked, was that a press release? Or did a person actually go out and talk to someone about what happened? When you're listening to the news, think about that. If there's no quote, there was nobody they talked to. And so if we had a full-time press person that all day, every day, would send information out to the world about what was going on with us, then you would think we were like the best people since sliced bread. But what the gentleman talked about in the back, as far as the media has never ever reported effectively on the experiences of the African American community. I don't expect that from the Oregonian. I never expected it from the Oregonian. Which is why, thank goodness, there's minority newspapers and outlets. And of course, now that we're in the age of internet, right, all of a sudden we've got access to so much more information and from a variety of sources. In fact, you can't even figure out who's a reporter nowadays because of all the blogging activity that takes place. But I think that's healthy. I will say that as far as the Oregonian, I think that's probably why they're going down, because they really have become a really bad newspaper. So now that they're, 3 or 4 days a week, and they're not, and they have a few reporters, like they've got a fabulous reporter, Maxine Bernstein, that's been covering the cops for a lot of years, and she's just fabulous, but they don't have that many investigative reporters anymore. And then I'll tell you something funny. One of my best media sources is the Portland Mercury. I call that like a little boys magazine, a teen boy magazine, but for some odd reason, they have some fabulous reporters that actually will go out and dig into stories that the Oregonian wouldn't even think of digging into. And so when you find good reporters, you go where they are, right? And you tell them the story, and so that the story gets out to the public. Maxine's good, but most of the other ones at the Oregonian just aren't there anymore.